Hi, my name is Kim Daniels, and I'm with Georgetown University's Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life. We're so glad to be hosting this gathering on faith, Latinos, and the 2020 campaign. This discussion is part of our Latino Leaders series of gatherings for young Latino Catholics, and we're so grateful to have so many of you joining us from around the country tonight. And tonight we'll discuss whether and how Latino voters could be decisive in the November elections here in the United States. As we face an ongoing pandemic, an economic crisis, and calls for racial justice, both campaigns are reaching out to Latino voters, one of the largest voting blocs in the country. Those of us here at the Initiative are so glad to be providing this forum and bringing together leading Latino Catholic journalists to explore what issues matter most to Latino voters, how Latinos are responding to the efforts of the campaigns, and how young Latinos can bring their faith and Catholic teachings to issues central to this election, including racial justice, COVID-19, human life and dignity, migration issues, and so many others. Joining us tonight are a fabulous group of reporters, and I'm so glad to have them here. Rhina Guidos, a reporter and editor at Catholic News Service, covers national and international events there, and she's the author of Rutilio Grande, A Table for All, about a Salvadoran Jesuit priest who inspired St. Oscar Romero. Milton Javier Bravo is an adjunct professor of theology at St. John's University, the director of audience development at Commonweal, and a doctoral candidate at Fordham University's Center for Catholic Leadership. And J.D. Long-García is a senior editor in America, where he oversees coverage of Latino Catholics in the United States. He's the former editor-in-chief of Angelus News, Vida, Nueva, and the Los Angeles Catholic Directory. We'll have an opportunity for questions and answers later on, so please send any questions you have to the email you see on your screen below. And please also share your thoughts on social media using the hashtag Latino Leaders and tagging the initiative at GUCST Public Life on Twitter. And with that, let's get started. Rhina, you're an experienced national reporter. You've covered migration issues closely, and you've done in-depth reporting from the border. And of course, the campaign is going full swing as we approach November. We're all still reeling, I think, from last night's debate. And just today, you published a major story on the Latino vote and how the Trump and Biden campaigns are reaching out and courting Latinos. So I have a few questions for you to help get us started. First, we have a great group of young adults watching tonight, and I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about your story, how you got to be where you are today. And second, help us think about the issues you see as mattering most to Latino Catholics. And also, how are Catholic teaching and faith affecting Latinos' approach to the election? And could Latino voters, in fact, affect the outcome of this election? So thanks for getting us started, Rhina.
Thank you, Kim. Good evening, everyone. As Kim said, my name is Rhina. I work with Catholic News Service. I started out as a crime reporter in Reno, Nevada. That is where my family settled. We came from El Salvador during the war in 1980. And I loved writing about crime. But because we had a language issue in the newsroom, I always tended to be the one who ended up writing about Latinos and Latinas. I've been doing that in some form for a little more than 20 years now, and in different states, in California, in Washington State, Nevada, Salt Lake City, Utah, and my last job, I did a little bit less, but I was crime editor in Wilmington, Delaware. And the way that I see faith affecting the way that we think about, the issues that we're going to vote about, or, that are important to us, it just depends on the degree that they affect us. And I have to tell you this one story about a curious case in Utah. I wrote about this woman who told me how she had these religious convictions about breaking laws, and she did not approve of immigration, illegal immigration. And it turned out that she ended up going across the border with the university she was with. And when she tried to come back in, she discovered that she did not have papers, as people say colloquially. Well, her views changed pretty fast when she came back in, and when she was trying to seek the help of a congressman. That's how I found out about her. And, I think that this shows how we tend to care about issues. How close are they to us? I think Latinos respond much in the same way. Some, are separated from some of these issues by generations, others by the proximity of what happens to those close to us, and that is going to affect, the way that that a person is going to enter the voting booth.
That makes a lot of sense, and thank you for that. I think that proximity to these issues is something that we all need to learn and become closer to. And now over to you, JD. You're a senior editor at America, and you oversee these issues there. Tell us a little bit more about your career and how you got to where you are, and also help us think about how faith and Catholic teaching has affected Latinos' approach to the election. And in particular, I'd love to hear a little bit more about whether Latinos and Latinas are a unified voting bloc, or whether in some sense they're disaggregated and we have to think of them in a more complicated way.
Thank you, Kim. It's great to be on the panel with Rhina and Milton Javier. I was born in the Dominican Republic. My father is from Chicago and my mom's from the Dominican Republic, so sort of a Latino hybrid. So I grew up speaking English and Spanish in a bicultural home. We moved to Puerto Rico first, and then to Arizona. And in Arizona in third grade, I was in ESL class, like English as a second language class. Which is quite a traumatic experience, but this isn't group therapy, so I won't tell you all about it. But anyway, after I went to graduate school, I started working in the Catholic press about 15 years ago. And here in Arizona, I'm in Arizona, and this was really a hotbed for tension about immigration, and it has been. There's been a lot of anti-immigration legislation that's happened here. There's been a lot of leaders. The sheriff of Maricopa County is infamous, also Catholic, for being kind of an anti-immigrant person. He's no longer in office, but he had been for a long time. And so how that all connected for me in terms of being a Catholic journalist was very clear as far as the dignity of the human person and what the church's teachings are about immigration. The faith itself and how it informs us at this time, I think it's important for us to recognize that, like, as Catholics, it's our responsibility to vote. And it's our responsibility to vote and be well-informed voters. So to study all of the issues. It's not just, I mean, the headlines and kind of like the soap opera stuff that's happening is between the presidential candidates right now. But there's a lot more than just the presidency that's at stake here. There's a lot of ballot issues that are local, and there's a lot of state and local representatives that we're voting for. And we have to know about all of that. And that's part of what it means to be Catholic, and recognizing that as we go through that, the dignity of every human person from conception until natural death. And so that's a huge part of it. Your question, Kim, is sort of getting to it just now about the monolithic group. I think this panel demonstrates that we're not monolithic as a community, the Latino community, or the Latinx community, or the Hispanic community. I mean, we can't even agree on what to call ourselves. I mean, we usually tend to know I'm Dominican, I'm Puerto Rican, or whatever, more so than necessarily identify with Latino or the Hispanic community more generally. We have very different cultural experiences. We have different, in some cases, different values, but we also have a lot of cultural values that are the same. But just to say, I mean, the obvious point perhaps that in Latin America, there isn't just one party. If you go to a Latin American country, it isn't like we're all on the same party. Like, oh, the Latin American country, and we get 100% voting on everything. No, there's plenty of division and plenty of tension in Latin America too. So anyway, so I think that's important to realize as we enter into this conversation, how Latin Americans come from very different places and with very different experiences, and then bring that here to the United States.
Thanks. That's wonderful. And I want to take that and go over to you, Milton. You've thought about Latino Catholics and political participation in your academic work and your work at Commonweal. Tell us a little bit about yourself as well, just so we can round things out, but also help us think a little bit more about what JD refers to in terms of people coming to this with different views, and in particular, how the Biden and Trump campaigns are reaching out to Latino voters in terms of all of those different views that people approach these issues with.
Well, thank you so much, Kim, and thank you to the initiative and Georgetown University for hosting this conversation. In the mid-1990s, when my family and I migrated to the States, I don't think we would have ever imagined that I would have been asked to speak at a panel hosted by Georgetown University, albeit virtually nonetheless. But as you mentioned, I am completing my doctorate at Fordham. I'm researching the Latino Hispanic Catholic experience in the United States and following on the footsteps of so many Latina theologians that have come before me. Some that are in the Midwest, others that are in the West Coast and the East Coast, certainly here. And part of my work at Commonweal as the Director of Audience Development has been informed by that academic research and that interest in the Latino Catholic experience, and helping both our editorial work as well as our publishing staff to be more reflective of and attuned to the issues, certainly the changing demographics in the United States and in our church, certainly the changes in geography, as we have seen how the Catholic Church continues to be present and alive and flourishing and growing in the South and Southwest. And that's certainly where the energy continues to be. And so in my work at Commonweal, I hope to help our editorial team bring forward and elevate these kinds of experiences and narratives and the voices of many times of individuals and communities that tend to be overlooked by other outlets. Certainly our Latino community has always continued to be felt like we continue to be invisible in the larger context, that we tend to be thought of between August and November for a presidential election, and then we're no longer thought of before that or beyond the November 3rd date. And certainly I, personally, just to share a little bit more about me, my family was very much lucky to find a path to citizenship, and I've been fortunate enough to study in Jesuit and Catholic universities in this nation. But many of the families that I grew up with, many of the families of my community here in Central Jersey, were not as lucky to have such a clear path to citizenship. And many of the families that I know lived in this mixed status, concept, in this mixed status reality, where some family members are citizens of this nation while others are not. And during the CARES Act and this ongoing pandemic, many of the families, if not all these families, were denied that's part of that stimulus package because of that mixed status family construct. And so I think that's, to get to your point, in terms of how Biden and Trump, both campaigns, have reached out to Latinos, as JD was mentioning, we're certainly, and as Rhina was mentioning, we certainly have different issues that we're really passionate about, really concerned about. Clearly, the ongoing pandemic is at the forefront. Clearly, the economic inequalities that this pandemic has illuminated is part of that. Clearly, the ongoing protest and the fight for racial and social justice is at the forefront. Certainly, playing Despacito at a conference, in Florida is not going to cut it, right? And certainly, stowing division and fear and playing off of people's fears is certainly not going to cut it either. And so, as we look at the Latino vote, as JD was mentioning, it's certainly not one community. There are Puerto Ricans that are concerned with the island, whether or not it's going to be brought in as a state, whether or not it's going to be recognized as a nation. Cuban Americans are concerned with their families and their issues. Central Americans, Mexicans, South Americans, they're concerned with their issues. And so I wonder, and yes, we're not monolithic, but I do wonder in this principle of solidarity, whether or not we can see the interconnectedness between our communities. And we can see how all of these issues are interwoven, and whether or not we can rise up as in the sense of caring for one another as brothers and sisters. Although I'm not Puerto Rican, can I be concerned with their issues? Although I'm not Cuban American, can I be concerned with their issues? Although I'm not seeking asylum at the US-Mexico border, Can I be concerned that children continue to be placed in cages, that the asylum process is completely finished at this point in this nation? And that's my hope, and that's where I wish that we will move towards as Latino communities in the United States.
That's wonderful. I think moving forward in solidarity, that's what Catholics bring generally to this, which we could bring generally to this conversation if we kept that teaching front and center. I want to talk a little bit more about what's going on right now with the campaigns. You talked about Playing Despacito doesn't cover it. Don't just focus between August and November on this community. Rhina, you had a great, terrific article today that kind of went through what's happening, what the Trump campaign is doing, what the Biden campaign is doing. We know that Latinos as a group supported Clinton over Trump in 2016 by a very large margin, but right now we're seeing Biden carrying Latinos, but not by as large a margin as happened in 2016. Do you think that's true? Why is it true? And how are the campaigns responding?
Well, I think it has to do with a lot of the things that, both Milton and JD mentioned. There are people who feel that the Democratic Party has taken them for granted. There's also a frustration. I talked to Dylan Corbett of Hope Border Institute for my piece today, and he was mentioning, all of these issues that have affected that young Latinos see affecting generations before them for so long, and they're still not fixed. So I think they're saying, well, if I've been supporting you for such a long time and you still haven't fixed it, what makes me think that if voting for you will fix it in the future for me, or, even for the people in my surroundings? I think there is that frustration. And I think that's part of it was behind, if you look at what happened in, what I call my home state of Nevada, it helped Bernie Sanders, during the primaries. That was a vote of dissatisfaction. And I think that's part of what's happening. I don't think, I listened to this conference last week, and they were saying that, while Trump does not have, is not gaining Latino voters, he's not losing them by as much. But I think this is whole part of this dissatisfaction of, what have you done for us? And the fact that, things continue, inequality, the way the pandemic has affected these communities. I think all those things are coming into play. And, it's hard to say whether even though the Latino community doesn't vote as a bloc, it does vote overwhelmingly Democratic, but what that margin is going to look like is going to tell us a lot, I think, in this election.
JD, what's your reaction to that? Do you think that Latino voters tend to see themselves as having been taken for granted? Do you think also that the pandemic is going to affect voter turnout in these communities in a significant way?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Rhina just said. I think Bernie is particularly an interesting candidate and what he represents for Latino voters. One other thing I think it's important to say here is that there's an impression that all Latinos, even on this panel, were immigrants, but most of the Latinos in the United States were born here. I'm here in the Southwest, and a lot of the Latino Catholics out here will say, hey, we didn't cross the border crossed us, because they've been here for such a long time. And then when I look at the representation of Latinos in government right now, we're underrepresented. We're underrepresented in our bishops and in our cardinals in the United States as well. Okay, but since this is about voting, we're underrepresented when it comes to our legislators, and I think that that's a huge thing to consider going forward. The Latinos are going to be the leaders of this country, and I think that we have to step forward to start taking those places, because I just think that there's that sense of community that Latinos understand that rather than choosing the next old white guy to represent us, we can represent ourselves in government. So I think that that's something we have to look at going forward.
Well, Milton, over to you then. What's your reaction to that? Why do you think President Trump is gaining purchase among Latino voters despite his racism, despite migration policies, et cetera? And also, how do you think we might get at this underrepresentation problem? Do you see that as something that we're working, that is going better now, or do you see that as something that is still somewhat intractable?
Yeah, sure. I think whenever we have these polls and the commentary on these polls, it's always good to look at the underlying data and how many people were actually asked to participate in the polls, right? And so the one that I recently have looked at is the one that was done by Univision, where they implemented and surveyed over 1,900 registered Latino voters. And within that, to get to the question and how Rhina was alluding to, overwhelmingly, right, over 66%, right, of Latinos will be voting as of this poll and as of now for Biden, right? But Trump and Pence and that ticket, the Republican ticket, gets about 24%, and that's certainly a bit of an increase between 18 to 24% in a 4-year span. But once you break down the different Hispanic origin sections, you can see there are clear differences. I mean, you have folks from the Dominican Republic who identify as the DR as being their Hispanic origin, that overwhelmingly 78% will be voting for Biden and Harris, as opposed to 15%, 1-5. And then you look at other parts of the, for example, Mexican Americans, 68% will be voting for Biden versus 23% for the Trump and Pence ticket. Where it's concerning is when we see, for example, I'm originally from Ecuador. I was born in Ecuador, so South America. And we see our brothers from South America origin in the United States and our brothers from Cuban descent in the United States, where that margin has increased, right? It jumps from 20% into the 30s in favor of that Trump and Pence ticket. And so we need to ask ourselves, why is there a difference? And I think that's what I was alluding to earlier. I think we're not caring enough for one another within our own Latino communities. I think because we're so separate, as Rhina was mentioning before, from those issues, then we don't need to be invested in caring enough of those issues. Certainly living up here in the Northeast, I'm a minority within a minority, right? As an Ecuadorian, I encounter a lot more Puerto Ricans, a lot more Cubans, a lot more Dominicans. And certainly you can see that there's even a disconnect between what goes on in their communities and the things and the issues that I'm concerned with, right? And certainly immigration is not at the top of the issues that we're concerned with as Latinos enter the voting booth. We're concerned with the economy, healthcare, coronavirus, and racial and ethnic inequality, as per one of the Pew studies that came out earlier this month. And to get to your other question, I think I've said this in other forums before, so I apologize if folks who are listening might have heard me say this before, but I think we can continue to talk about diversity and inclusion, and we continue to talk about these issues. But when are we actually going to become diverse? When are we actually going to be inclusive? And I don't just simply mean in terms of welcoming people of color into spaces that were predominantly white spaces in the past. But when are we going to allow Latinos, Latinas, African Americans, Asian Americans to be the leaders, as JD was mentioning, that we can be, and to build the future that we want to build, that we must be?
I hear what you're saying, and I want to get Rhina's reaction to it, given several things you've written, Rhina. I think that when you talk about Latinos bringing and Catholics bringing ideas of community and solidarity to their political involvement, I'm interested in seeing if that's true for young Latino Catholics, and in particular, if having been disappointed by political parties, as we've heard here tonight, they find other avenues to affect change in their communities. And what might that be? Do you think that they try to affect social change in different ways, by participating in protests, by community action, anything else? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, I think there's a couple of interesting things happening. Again, going back to El Paso, when I was talking to, Dylan Corbett about what they were doing, it's become very difficult to, go door to door and, host these large events where a lot of them were present before. Well, what a lot of young people have been doing is going to these food drives. And that is where they have been able to register voters. And that has been a lot of, young people who are themselves going to these places, not just to distribute food, but also to enroll others in voting, and also getting them to think about their role as faith voters. And also their responsibility, not just for themselves, but for other people. I think is, the interesting thing about El Paso also is how the leadership of the church kind of takes them that way. And a plug for JD's America Magazine today had a great piece by Bishop Seitz that, I think everybody should look at, where he talks about how there has been some manipulation by political parties to, grab one issue, become a single issue vote on, let's just put it out there, abortion. But at the same time, you're neglecting all these other people who are getting left behind. I think when it comes to Latinos, I don't, some people would say that we're just as polarized. I don't see it that way. At least, again, I think church leadership has a lot to do with it in your locality. But I here in Washington, we have a huge Salvadoran community, but we also have Cubans. We're all affected, we're all affected by different issues. But you still, maybe because it's a political town, but we get together a lot to talk about these things, even though we may not agree on them. And, as people of faith, we still talk to one another. We still have to sit next to one another in the pews. But again, I think that has a lot to do with what your local leadership is talking about. And I think that this is an issue where the church at the local level can be effective. Now, you have some places where that doesn't happen, and it's become, sadly, national news. And, I think that that's where bishops can take leadership roles in trying to figure out how do we all live in peace, despite our differences.
Thank you. And thanks for holding up Bishop Seitz and the Hope Border Institute, who I think do such wonderful work down in El Paso. And that's a terrific article in America Today. And speaking of America, let's go back to you, JD, and talk a little bit, shift gears a little bit. We have a great question that's come in, and it's on that dynamic between Black Lives Matter and the concern about the way Latinos are treated by society. And the person, our interlocutor asks, are communities of color allies or competitors for attention and action, or both? And how is that dynamic working out? How have we seen that work out over the course of the past several months as we've had all of these movements for racial justice? And after that, maybe Milton, you can react as well. So JD?
Yeah, I think unquestionably allies. I don't think that that's a question. I think I wrote an article not too long ago about racism within the Latino community. This is something that we have to confront as well. I was born in the Dominican Republic, and we have a shameful history of how we've treated Haitians, and that's something that we have to confront. I interviewed a man from Central America who's an indigenous person who was, I don't want to repeat what we printed it, but I don't feel comfortable repeating what he actually told me about the way that he was treated as an indigenous person in Central America. So I think that it gets complex there too with our own history of racism within the Latino community. There is a lot of racism there too historically, where we have embodied the colonizer mindset and it sort of adopted that. And that has to be confronted. I think you do see that with, in some cases, the differences within the vote. The other thing I would say there is just that oftentimes the generations of Latinos will vote differently. The people who are fourth, fifth, sixth generation vote differently than the ones that are more recently arrived. And even between, younger people tending to vote one way and older people voting a different way. So I think that there's that complexity too. So, but anyway, I unquestionably, I think that we're allies and we're working toward the same thing as far as equality, and which was meant to be part of the founding of the country, but something that wasn't executed at the time. But if you look at the founding documents of this country, that's the idea, equal treatment under the law. We still haven't gotten there yet, but it's still a noble goal for all of us as Americans to strive for.
Thank you. We're getting so many great questions coming in. Milton, I want to get your reaction to what JD said. And also, I'd like to pick up, because one of our questions refers to this, of the idea of generational differences among Latinos, so that perhaps older Latinos who might think that they worked hard to get here and people who are just trying to get in are getting a free ride or something. Can you react to that as well?
Sure. So I'll take that second question first, the generational difference, and then I'll say something about JD. To me, what's interesting about the generational difference, and I'm not the only one that has said this, other journalists, folks like Ricardo Varela and Maria Hinojosa, who have been doing this work, right, for Latino Rebels and Futuro Media and working with NPR, they have all sort of made this point that the political pundits, if you will, can't understand now the Latino vote, because that Latino vote, how they're sort of conceptualized it, might be a reference to in sort of an older, different generation of Latinos that were at one point voting in the 1990s, in the early 2000s. But clearly now, as we have seen, there are more young Latinos engaged in the political process. And it's really not hard to miss them because they're out on the streets. I was at a conference at Notre Dame in June of 2019, where I would hear, folks, the elders in our community lamenting that young Latinos are not in the pews, like young Latinos don't care, young Latinos are not here. And I would say, you do realize that they're out in the streets, right? When people are protesting, it's typically young people that are out there. And if you're seeing a Latino, it's typically a Catholic Latino, Catholic Latina who's out there in a women's march, in the protest after the George Floyd murder. They're out there in the streets protesting. And so when it comes to the generational differences, I think we're seeing that fight for equality, as JD was mentioning, that really the younger generation has taken upon themselves to be invested and to search for an answer. Now, to mention what was said earlier about Mark Seitz and in America Magazine publishing the article today, with Commonweal over the summer, we produce a two-part podcast series on the El Paso massacre that occurred on August 3rd of 2019. And we wanted to really discuss with members of the community how that tragedy affected not only the families of the victims, but the El Paso community, and how throughout the year, including the pandemic, has continued to be used as a tool to stop the asylum at the border. And so we spoke with folks like Monsignor Arturo Bañuelas, who was a first responder to this massacre, theologian Naomi de Anda, who helped us think critically and theologically about this moment in our nation's history. Dylan and Marissa from Hope Border as well, Rhina, and Mark Seitz, Bishop Mark Seitz. And so both Bishop Mark Seitz and Professor Naomi spoke about how these lives matter and how Black lives matter. And Bishop Mark Seitz, in his pastoral letter, had the power to name white supremacy, had the power to name racism within that context of the sins of the church in the past, of the sins of the church in the now, in the present. And so certainly we need to say that Black lives matter, because unless Black lives matter, all of our lives won't matter, right? We have to be able to see how all of these issues are interconnected, not only in the political context, but certainly in our church context, as JD was mentioning before.
Thanks for that. And I want to give this question to all of you. I think that, clearly the church talks about how all of these life issues are interconnected. And at the same time, as we try to think about how and why some Latino voters are attracted to the Trump campaign, I get back to abortion. And I wonder if there's a particular focus on that issue, right? Because that is interconnected with these other life issues too. And is it a matter of, does the Latino community, and I know I'm using that word too broadly, focus on that issue and hold it up as well? Rhina, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that, once again, I don't mean to talk about El Paso so much. I've only been there once, but one of the really interesting things that, came out of, also in Bishop Sight's letter was, what Pope Francis has told us. This is not, we just think about this. All of these things are connected. All of these things are connected. The way that we exclude people, the way that we push them to the margins through environmental issues, through poverty, exclusion from the economy. I think that one of the interesting things that I look at with, how young Latinos are responding to the message from the Holy Father. And I think that they're doing it, exactly to Milton's point. They're going out and, that's a form of prayer for some of them. They do consider that a form of prayer, to go out into the streets and to call for justice and to join, people who don't look like them. I think they're responding. It's interesting how, church teaching, even though, we have traditional methods, I think that the Pope is really speaking and getting a message through to young Latinos, at least, that, we don't just have to talk about abortion. Abortion is part of this whole, an integral, way of looking at the world. So I think, that if you look again at the what Bishop Seitz published today, it explains that a little bit, friendlier, and then, what is happening, I think, and how young Latinos are looking at it.
JD, I see you nodding. And one of the questions that's coming in asks if Catholicism is declining among younger generations, and how will that impact votes going forward? I wonder if you can react to that in the context of what Rhina just said about Pope Francis really being someone that younger generations respond to, and maybe Milton, you can follow up on that. JD?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is yes. The Catholicism is diminishing among younger people. The recent surveys have looked at even Catholicism among Latinos in general, having been on a slight decline since 2000, although it seems to be about half of Latinos are still Catholic. So I think that's an important consideration. But yeah, so I think that there are fewer Latinos that are Catholic, and that probably tracks with some differences in voting too, where more evangelical Latinos are more likely to be Trump supporters, or more likely to be Republicans than Catholic Latinos in general. I also just want to mention, within the last year, I reported on the pro-life support among the Latino community, because Latinos tend to be more pro-life than the Anglo community. So that's actually something that is a fairly major concern among the Latino community. But I also did a story about Latinos for Trump. And it was harder to get people on the phone for that, suspicious of the media kind of thing. But I did find some, and they expressed their support for President Trump much more in terms of being entrepreneurs, and that one of the gentlemen that I spoke with said that he lost his job during the Obama administration, and he got a job during the Trump administration, and he credits President Trump for his job, basically. So I think that there are some things like that I don't want to cheapen that either. Like there are certainly religious values or values that I hold as a Catholic, but I also want to be able to provide for my family. I think there are political difference or ideological differences with how you think the economy should be run, but I think that there's something that connects to our family values as Latinos and community values as Latinos of being able to provide for for our loved ones. That's why people are losing their lives crossing the border, is because that's why they're coming. What they're coming to do is they're coming here to work.
Thanks for that. And Milton, I want to get your reaction to that, but we also have several people writing in and sort of going the opposite direction, asking, number one, what price does President Trump pay for the way that he talks about and treats immigrants? You know, President Bush advocated for comprehensive immigration reform, and now that's completely off the table for the GOP, it seems. So what price do they pay for that? And in particular, what do we do about to what extent should Latino voters be concerned about Trump's attack on democratic norms and institutions as well?
Sure. So just getting back to the original question about abortion, in the Pew Research study that I cited earlier, abortion came in at the end of those issues that Latinos are concerned with. There were the first is the economy, healthcare, coronavirus, racial and ethnic inequality. And it went through violent crime, climate change, immigration was somewhere in the middle of the list, gun policing policy, economic inequality, foreign policy, and last but certainly not least was the abortion issue. And that seems to be, I think, a clear difference in at least the way that I have come to understand sort of the Anglo-Euro-American Catholic space and imagination versus the Latino Catholic imagination, if you will. Latinos may not religiously affiliate with the Catholic Church, but first and foremost, the Catholic faith begins at home, right? And that is one main difference in terms of how we express our Catholicism. It is through spiritual devotions, it is through symbolism, it is through cultural and family-led traditions. It is through different art expressions and paintings and crucifixes and those kinds of symbolisms that share something about our faith and say something about what's important to us as Latinos and as Catholics. And to just slightly, JD, in the spirit of friendly ecumenism here, the declining number, yes, Catholics overall have come down to about 50% or so in terms of the United States, but the Catholics that are in the pews, the Catholics that have actually stayed in the Catholic Church, 14 to 29, young Catholics, ages 14 to 29, 50% of them are Latinos. So when you talk about declining, Catholics not coming to Mass, not being part of the sacramental life of the Church, well, many times you're speaking to only half of the audience because 50% are Latinos and they're not seeing themselves reflected in the church hierarchy. They're not seeing themselves reflected in the leadership of the church. They're not seeing themselves reflected in the same issues that they're concerned with, whether or not their bishops are concerned with. And, kudos to Bishop Mark Seitz, kudos to Bishop Sherry, the auxiliary bishop of New Orleans, both who have decided to take a stand against racism, against white supremacy, have taken a stance, for racial and social justice. And the Latinos that are going to come back to the pews, they're going to recognize that message because it's much more holistic than the one single issue that perhaps other Catholics, white Catholics, may be concerned with.
Rhina, do you see that? So you talked a little bit earlier about young people seeing their protest as a form of prayer. Do you see more leadership among bishops on these issues now? And also, we have someone asking, do young people also want to see open discussion on issues in the church, on these kinds of issues, and they don't see it? Would that be something that would draw young people in? Rhina and then JD.
I think it may, it's hard to say. It may have been there all along. It's just that now because of social media, it's a lot more visible than I think it was before. Before, we were all in our own little spaces. Now we can see what's going on in a lot of different parts of the country on these things. And, in fact, a lot of, I mean, I'm not going to, name names, but you see a lot. I wish X would be my bishop, you see a lot of that. And you also, but you'll see it both ways, from depending on what political point of view you grab it from. You see that, but I think you can still be somebody from a different background and still be able to, identify with your constituency. And, again, when you read Bishop Seitz's piece, he talks about fragility. He uses that word fragility and, as referring to this little girl, but also, the fragility that he felt, the fragility that El Paso felt during this, this mass shooting that they had last year. I think, there's a big point to be made about how some of them have shown that fragility. I think that, Bishop Stowe, for example, in Lexington also has, walked across a lot of different paths to also showing fragility with those who've lost their jobs in the coal industry, which is not from some points of view, they say, oh, well, coal should be gone. But, he says it's hard to watch people lose their jobs, and their livelihoods. So I think all of these things have been there all along. I just think that, we're starting to see them more from different types of media, social media that's out there. But, certainly I think that, people reach out, to one another. The bad thing, I think, is they sort of, they create their own little group, even across a distance. And we need to be reaching out to people that we disagree with, within our midst and next to our pews. I think, there's good and there's bad about that, I think.
Well, I think that, you point out something important, and I'll go to you with this, JD, that Catholic social teaching can often be, we see it here at the initiative as a unifying force that can bring people together across differences. And some bishops are standing up and really promoting that. And you see young people reacting well to that. JD, do you think that's the case? Do you think Pope Francis's new encyclical coming out next Monday, which will be on solidarity and fraternity, human fraternity, and connecting across these divides and getting at that fragility and caring for one another, do you think those are the kind of messages that draw young people in?
Yeah, I do very much. The Fratelli Tutti, very much looking forward to that. It feels like something you should order from IHOP a little bit, But yeah, I think that young people, I went to the Quinto Encuentro National Gathering. The Quinto Encuentro is something that, if you're not aware of, we should definitely become aware of, because it's an initiative by the church to better serve the Latino community in the United States. But there were so many people gathered there together and ready to take leadership in the church as lay people. This is maybe a different panel, but I think that there's an issue with how lay people are entrusted with leadership in the church, and that includes Latinos in the church, because that doesn't seem to happen. So that young people are here, they're in our pews, like Milton alluded to, they're a vibrant part of our Catholic communities everywhere. And they are the future of the Catholic Church as they are the future of this country. When I look at this, a lot of the complexities surrounding this election, I think I would just want to echo what Rhina was saying about coming together with people that we disagree with. I was, I think, one of almost everybody on earth that was shocked at the 2016 election results. I didn't see that one coming. And I think that it's important for us, even today, as we're seeing these sometimes inexplainable trends with what we might expect Latinos to act in a particular way or vote a particular way, to take time to stop and listen and understand what that is. And I would echo that with young people and the youth ministers that I've interviewed recently. They say that that's what they need. That's what they want to be listened to. And oftentimes they're not being listened to by church leaders, and they're not being empowered to lead. And I think that would be a great blessing for us, for the church here in the United States, and I think that's connected to leaders in government too. It's for us to step up ourselves as Latinos in leadership, but also to ask for that empowerment to become leaders within our church and within our society.
And I'd love to hear what you have to say about that. And someone writes in and asks us about some church leaders who push back against Black Lives Matter, who call it demonic, who say this isn't an issue. So maybe from both angles, right? So in other words, how are we drawing young people in, and what do those efforts do for young people and more broadly for the church in the United States? How can we react? How should we think about that?
Yeah, so I believe it was last week, there was a panel on the Catholic vote, I think sponsored by the Hanks Center out of Loyola, Chicago. And there they were discussing how Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, these three states, were going to be crucial for that quote unquote Catholic vote. And so we got to look at those three states and also see how the Latino Catholic vote, if you will also have an impact on the election, and to kind of think that through, because it is in these places where young Latino Catholics who have now turned 18, who will be voting for the first time. It's projected to be 32 million eligible Latino voters for the fall. Will be the second voting bloc after the white vote in this fall. So I think we got to keep in mind, as we look at all these different results coming in, especially from places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, how young Latinos have been voting. And just to echo what folks have said already, JD and Rhina have said, where I find hope is that the bishops, to a certain degree, and certainly Latino bishops in particular, such as Nelson Perez, who leads the Office of Cultural Diversity in the Church from the USCCB, they know that this process of listening to the Latino community is helpful, right? And that's the expression of a synodal process, right? That's where Pope Francis wants to take the entire church, the global church, to that place where we're not just simply bringing down dogma and teaching upon people, but we're actually listening to their concerns and their issues. And so in addition to the Encuentro process, right now I've been paying close attention to this Journeying Together process sponsored by the USCCB Office of Cultural Diversity with young adults and those that minister to young adults. And even in those spaces, yes, we want to go back to church. Yes, because of the pandemic, we're not able to gather in community in our parishes. But again, the same issues about the pandemic, job security, how we know someone that has lost their lives due to COVID. These are at the forefront of our mind and our concerns during this time. And then to answer the question of the, just very briefly, and a little plug here for Commonweal, in October, and we will have 4 events every Monday in October related to reimagining U.S. Catholicism. And one of those Mondays will be geared towards Catholic formation and education, looking at everything from Sunday CCD sort of catechism all the way up to secondary and higher ed formation. And I invite you to come and listen to that. Certainly folks like Hosman Ospino would have some thoughts about that, as well as Dr. Cecilia Gonzalez Andreu. I would just say that I think that's much of a bigger conversation related to formation in our seminaries, related to who is actually teaching young seminarians, and how much experience they're actually having out in these neighborhoods. And so I invite you all to come and join us the 4 Mondays in October.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because we have a really great audience, a really large audience tonight of young adult Catholics. And I'm glad you mentioned the Commonweal conversations. I'm glad you mentioned the Hanks Center conversation, and there's a series there as well. And the one you mentioned was just wonderful. There's so many robust resources out there if you're interested in the intersection of Catholicism and public life. And I hope all of you watching explore that and follow up on it. And just to round out our conversation here, and of course, at America and at CNS, there's an enormous amount of resources. We have a lot of that on our resource page here at the initiative if you want to follow up. We've talked about different angles from which people approach Catholicism in public life. And we have to say that this is all so often in good faith, right? I mean, people are trying to live out their faith the best they know how. And so this last question kind of gets at how we do that together, how we do that in solidarity, even if we come at it from different perspectives within our Catholic and Latino communities. How do you all find that you get past this polarization polarization, and that you have conversations with your friends, with those you work with your family about these issues, even when you have robust disagreement. Can you give us some tips maybe that you've come across? Because I'm sure you've seen this kind of conflict before, and I don't know if one of you wants to go first. JD?
I was looking forward to the answer to this question, maybe taking some notes. No, in just as a journalist in general, I find like St. Francis of Assisi's prayer very, very helpful. And it's kind of echoes like even the AA prayer. Grant that I may not so much seek to be understood as to understand. I think that that's the first step, is to listen when you're engaging in these conversations and to really listen to where the other person is coming from. I think that that's a move towards solidarity. I certainly have disagreements about different issues with my friends and with my family, and it's been very, very tense during the pandemic and during the election, and that's been going on for years. But you know, when I'm behaving a little bit more with more grace, I guess I'm listening more often than I'm trying to get my point across, and that coming together, that kind of communion, I think it's something that can facilitate a positive direction forward.
Okay, great. We're getting close to the end. And so, Rhina, I'm going to go to you. And if you have any ideas about responding to this polarization, that's great. But I'd like to go once around as well, starting with you, to talk about what action steps people can take who are watching this tonight. What can they do in reaction to what they've heard to act on the conversation we've had? Rhina?
I think that, you know, the one thing to keep in mind most is that, you know, we're brothers and sisters. You know, we're not here, we shouldn't be here or in the pews or anywhere else if we're going to, you know, keep other people down or not help them or send them to their deaths or, you know, in various forms. I think we need to keep Christ, you know, in mind, and the life of Christ in our actions, in not being nasty to people online, especially. You know, in the pews, anywhere we encounter them, no matter how bad it gets. If it gets that bad, you know, walk away. But, you know, I am just stunned at especially some of what I've seen in this election cycle online, and we're talking about church officials as well. You know, it's been stunning. You know, but again, you know, keep in mind that other people are watching. You know, that's not the point if you read the gospel of how we're supposed to live our lives or build the kingdom of God here. It goes against that. So, you know, no matter how much you think I really don't like this person or this point of view, you know, don't go there. And, you know, Latinos like food. Sit and have, I know it's harder during the pandemic, but go have a drink with that person. Go, you know, go break some bread with them. You would talk about, you know, what you can come together about instead of, you know, what you can fight about.
Wonderful. Milton, how about you? What's one action step that people can take after listening to this conversation? And then we'll end it with you, JD.
Sure. So just very briefly, in terms of the polarization, I think there's a sense of individualism there. And I think actually Bishop Mark cited that in his column today. And I'm going to take a page from you know, Saint Oscar Romero, that he saw both the presence of God in Jesus, both in the tabernacle, but as well as in the people that he encountered every day on the streets, especially the poor and the marginalized. And I think it's how we encounter one another. If it begins from a perspective of, can I see Jesus in the other? Can I see God in the other? That may change the way that we interact with one another, I would imagine. And finally, you know, an action, Bishop Sherry invited us, some young adults on Monday night, which was 2 days ago, to go out and seek 9 individuals, and make sure that they register to vote, and then follow up with those 9 individuals that they actually went to the polls and actually voted, or voted via mail, clearly. And those 9 people will stand for those 8 minutes and 46 seconds of George Floyd's murder. So I invite you, though, everyone that's listening, not only get people to register to vote, but accompany them through the voting process and into November.
Thank you, Milton. JD, let's end with you. And first, I want to mention that the letter that Bishop Seitz wrote is at America. The article that he wrote is at America that everybody keeps referring to here today. JD, talk to us about what you think might be some action that people could take in response to our conversation.
Yeah, I just to say, I mean, I have an image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, La Virgen de Guadalupe behind me. I learned about her from my Mexican-American brothers and sisters here in Arizona. And my faith is richer because I have taken the time to listen to other people and to pray with them. So I think one very maybe obvious step is to pray and to ask, to invite the Holy Spirit, like I think the Latino community is so good at doing, invite the Holy Spirit into your life and to lead you in action. So I would say that's very important. And secondarily, perhaps, before you go out and vote, be an informed voter by reading Commonweal, Catholic News Service, and America Magazine.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That's a wonderful way to end this conversation. And thank you all for this wonderful conversation. I want to remind all of you that this discussion will be recorded and posted on our website and our social channels for later viewing as well. And we'll have follow-up resources at our site as well. I want to thank all of you watching for joining us here for this virtual Latino Leaders Gathering. And I want to let you know about a few other gatherings that we have coming up. Next Monday, October 5th, the initiative is co-hosting an online Dahlgren dialogue with the Office of Mission and Ministry here at Georgetown on Pope Francis's new encyclical that we mentioned earlier. We'll have Cardinal Michael Cherney, Edith Avila Olea, Claire Giangrave, and Sister Nancy Schreck to talk about the encyclical. On Tuesday, October 13th, the initiative will co-host an online Salt and Light gathering for young leaders under 40 with the Archdiocese of Washington on religion and race, the future of anti-racism in the Catholic Church. On October 20th, we'll have an online public dialogue on faithful citizenship in the 2020 presidential election as part of our series on faith in the faithful. And on October 27th, we'll hold an online public dialogue on the moral and public obligations of political winners and losers in elections. Thanks to my colleagues, John Carr and Anna Misla, for everything they did to help bring this together. And we're especially grateful to everyone who helped us on the technical end of things, including our partners at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, Optimum Audio, and AI Media. And finally, please join me in thanking our wonderful panel, Rhina Guidos, Milton Bravo, and JD Long-García for being a part of this incredibly enlightening discussion. Thanks to you all.